My name is Elliott Hazen, and I'm a research professor at UC Santa Cruz, but housed here with NOAA's Environmental Research Division at Pacific Grove. I started as a postdoc here working with Dr. Stephen Vograd, and a lot of my background had been in relating environmental features and prey to top predator distributions. And I'd done this with whales on the East Coast and other marine mammal species, basically around the world. And so when I came out here, I was involved with a few meetings, and some of my quantitative skills appeared to be pretty useful for analyzing some of the tracking data that Barb and her colleagues have been collecting. Yeah, so I do a lot of essentially species habitat models, looking at how individual species are distributed in this very heterogeneous, very dynamic ocean environment. And so what are the ocean features, the underlying physical features and biological features that make for good or bad habitat for these species? There's essentially two different components of the habitat model. The first is trying to figure out what are the environmental variables that are underlying good and bad habitat. So that's essentially the first step. The second step that we're often more interested in for management purposes or conservation is using that to actually predict, are there areas of habitat that we may not have surveyed, the animals may not have gone to, that are critical habitat areas in the ocean. And so if we understand what the ocean features are that the animals like, we can look for their similar ocean features around the world's oceans. Hotspots essentially are areas of either high biodiversity, high what we call trophic transfer, which means that there's a lot of energy going from the physical environment through things like phytoplankton up to top predators, or just areas that are really critical for a specific species life stage, such as spawning habitat for bluefin tuna in the Gulf of Mexico. Where if you lost that habitat, you'd have a very large population level effect.
Okay.
So there's a few tools that we use, and one of the difficulties with tracking data is there's a lot of modeling that has to be done to make it essentially as optimal as it can be, as usable as it can be. And then what we do is we look at where we have multiple individuals going to a specific area, and that is our initial kind of designation of hotspots. So when we can find there are areas where 5, 10, even up to 15 species may go, that area will be much more of a hotspot than one where only one species is going. So we use the tracking data alone initially to set up these hotspots, and then use the modeling procedures to then look for hotspots or predict for hotspots in other areas and other time periods as well. Prey and actually nutrients underneath that makes them hotspots for prey. So those hotspots are again more static, kind of in space and time, but also the upwelling dynamics here on the west coast end up forming much more temporally narrow hotspots, so much more kind of short-lived hotspots. So the upwelling season starts, a lot of nutrients are brought up essentially with the cold waters as they're brought to the surface, and essentially the food chain starts, the trophic transfer begins. And these hotspots then can persist at the broad scales over the entire kind of area of upwelling. But at the finest scales, features such as eddies, fronts, things where you have basically nutrient-rich water that's brought up into the photic zone, into the light, that can then lead to phytoplankton blooms and start again this chain of food. One of the more important management strategies that are being used now are marine protected areas, for example. And marine protected areas are often designed to maximize essentially the conservation of these biological hotspots while minimizing lack of use to users such as fishermen, shipping lanes, things like that. The problem is, as I mentioned, it's a very dynamic ocean, and so one of the goals that we're trying to use these hotspots for is, can we predict these hotspots and how they move with space and time, so that we can create essentially dynamic protected areas that move with the hotspots as they change throughout seasons and throughout years. And this isn't being done on a broad scale yet, but an area like the California current that is so predictable, yet also so dynamic, is a perfect place to try this out. Part of the Barbara Bloch's 2011 Nature paper, we were able to look at a suite of ocean variables and come up with which ones were most important in essentially underlying these areas of high biodiversity and high species use. And the two primary variables again and again were sea surface temperature and chlorophyll at these very broad, essentially ocean basin scales. So what we did is we looked for climate models that were very reliable in the Northeast Pacific and also included projections of sea surface temperature and chlorophyll so that we could get, again, kind of these two most important criteria and look out to 2100, so look out almost 100 years into the future. And so once we were able to identify the relationships between each of the individual species with sea surface temperature and chlorophyll, we then could project this out to 2100 and see where hotspots may either shift, increase, decrease, or in some instances, unfortunately, just disappear. So one of the things that we found that was really reassuring is that the California current appears to remain as important a hotspot, if not more so, into the future. And this makes sense just from a knowledge of the upwelling, that the upwelling, even though we're going to have warming in the Pacific, the upwelling, these pulses of cold waters, will help to essentially neutralize the effects of warming here off the California coast. In addition, and one really important area, the North Pacific Transition Zone, which serves as a highway from essentially the eastern and western Pacific. A lot of species like tunas will use it to travel across. That is an area that actually is going to be shifting northward about essentially 10 to 100 kilometers per decade. And that means that the further north it goes, the less available it could be to some of these more tied to land species, for example. Yeah, and there are a bunch of direct and kind of indirect effects. And the reason they're direct and indirect, some we can manage for immediately, some that are more kind of distal, that are any changes we do won't be seen for many years down the road. Climate change being a good example of one of these indirect effects. Some of the more direct effects that we both are mandated and have the ability to manage for right now are fisheries, fishing bycatch, for example, for species that are protected species, as well as things like shipping traffic and shipping lanes, because there's one of the big issues is some species like blue whales on the west coast are in a period of trying to recover, but it's believed that a lot of ship strikes are one of the main areas of risk of mortality that's limiting their recovery. So using both this understanding of where these risks are from the work like Ben Halpern has done, but also forecasting where these distributions might change, putting those two together, I think we can provide a much more holistic management approach than we currently have. So one of the things that I like about tracking data is that you can actually see what an individual animal is doing, and you can pretend, or at least kind of try to get in the head of the animal and look at the decisions it's making. So one of my things is I would always say, if an animal is swimming in a straight line and suddenly makes a turn, why did it do that? Is there a reason that maybe we can look at some of the oceanographic data to see, is it suddenly making this decision based on the environment, or maybe there's another external force? So that's one of the kind of first things I dig into. The second, to me, again, is when there's an animal that is moving and it stops moving, why did it stop? And it's having a high residence time in a specific area. Are there specific ocean features that we can look at, things like temperature, again, and chlorophyll, that might underlie why this animal is spending so much time in that area? So those, to me, from my background, are kind of two of the things that are most interesting to me. Another neat one that you can do with this is look at how different species work together. So are they all swimming to the same spot, or are there certain species that like to go to one area and a different set of species like to go somewhere else? And so looking at some of those kind of ecological relationships are what drives at least my scientific interests.
Uh-huh. And if you were to imagine, say, 10 years down the road when some of these students are going to be, moving on into professional careers and so on, where do you think the animal tracking world will be, a decade from now? What do you see as the future of this field?
I can put both my hopes and what I think is probably more realistic. Hopefully we'll get to the point where tags will be both cheaper and much smaller, so that we will have a much higher degree of animals interested in the ocean, because the best way to figure out where the animals like to go, rather than doing shipboard surveys or even remotely send surveys of these animals, is to have them tracked and know where they're going. That can tell us the most about some of these behavioral choices and where they are. And so I think ultimately, if we can get essentially smaller tags that can last longer, and it's kind of a three-headed beast that you're asking for the world, but the smaller tags last longer, and ideally collecting more data that can tell us really where the animals are going and why they're going there. So I think that fundamentally, one of the things we'll be doing in the future is putting basically things like iPhones on the back of these animals' heads, which already is actually going on a bit, so that the iPhone has a lot of these same sensors, things like accelerometers, has an ability to communicate with us, take pictures. So I think our tags and maybe some of our own personal electronics might converge into the future to have similar uses. And so one of the most important things that I guess, and both exciting things that I do on a daily basis with regards to the science, is coming up with my guesses, my hypotheses as to why these animals are doing what they're doing. And part of that is building up to the point where you look and you see, oh, these animals are doing things, in a predictable, reliable manner. Coming up with hypothesis, maybe it's a result of a cold core eddy. Can I look at the SST and then test that? So coming up with this hypothesis that a hotspot on April 15th, 2013 was, occurred off the coast of California because there was a cold core eddy there. And then once you have that hypothesis set up, you can use a framework like Ocean Tracks to go and test that and look at the oceanographic data to see, is this hotspot directly on top of an area of cold temperature surrounded by a ring of warm, for example. And that approach to me is really valuable in starting to think like a scientist and getting into the into the scientific framework and of what I do on a pretty much daily basis. So one of the difficulties is, even though we are collecting much more data than we have been able to in the past, a lot of that data has essentially basic limitations, where from one track where that animal went, but you don't necessarily know all the areas where that animal could have gone. And so the approach of modeling is allowing you to essentially make inferences based on a set of data, and to the point where you can essentially extend your inferences beyond what you could do by looking at the data alone. And so for a lot of the models, again, that I'm doing, is if you had one good example, well, if you had an example where there's only one animal that uses an ocean feature, but it uses it very heavily, you can then use that to say, are there ocean features in other areas that similar animals are using, build a modeling framework where you have that ocean feature as a response variable, and then test it and say, are they significantly using these features more than they would be by random chance alone. And so that the modeling approach allows us to get past some of the messy parts of tracking data, or essentially account for the messy parts in tracking data, and come up with a framework that they can test our hypothesis directly.